Hi everyone, hope you're having a great conference so far. Thank you very much to Alicia for inviting me to speak to you today. And I understand Maria Murray spoke before me, so I'm going to be drawing on a lot of what Maria said, which I am sure I will have agreed with 100%, and hopefully not repeat too much, but extend on what she was telling you about the science of reading. My name is Jennifer Buckingham. I am a Director of Strategy and Senior Research Fellow at Multilit, which is a publisher of reading programs, amongst other things. So Multilit is, as I said, a publisher of programs, all evidence-based programs, and the sorts of evidence I'm going to talk to you about today are the things that underpin the development of our programs, and actually the implementation of our programs and the data we collect also contributes to that evidence base. So we have whole class, small group and one-to-one instructional programs. We have a lot of resources, including decodable books and other sorts of resources, and offer professional development. We have literacy centres where we directly work with children who are struggling with reading, using a variety of different programs depending on what it is that they need to work on. And we also have a research unit, which I'm a part of, and it undertakes research in the programs that we are implementing. So conducting field trials and evaluations, making sure that they are effective before we let schools use them. That's a great principle of ours, is to make sure that we ensure that our programs are effective, as well as doing more general research on reading instruction and other aspects of literacy. We publish in academic journals and in a range of other forums. And we also have a project called 5 from 5. And the 5 from 5 project is designed to try to spread that evidence base more widely. So it's not program specific, but it is acknowledging the fact that we don't own that evidence, that it's there for everybody, and we really want everyone to be able to draw on it, whether they're using multi-lit programs or not. And we provide that information through a website. And also we have a publication called Nomanis, which is a free periodical, which you can find just by Googling Nomanis and multi-lit, and it will turn up. This is what the 5 from 5 website looks like, and you'll find a wealth of information there with links and videos and all kinds of other useful things for you on that site. So a bit of an overview about what we will talk about today. First of all, we'll touch on the alphabetic principle. It is really as a key idea in the teaching of reading that you would think was well understood, but actually it's more something that most people understand implicitly rather than explicitly. Some of the key concepts that come from the science of reading in terms of reading acquisition, particularly for beginning readers. We'll talk about evidence-based instruction. And then I'll talk a bit about policy and practice. So, you know, that piece that takes us from, okay, well, this is what we know, into, well, what are we actually doing? The alphabetic principle is essentially that print is a code for speech. It was invented thousands of years ago so that people could transcribe oral language into writing, so it would be easier to transmit it and record it for all kinds of reasons. But it's not something that we are born knowing. It's not imprinted in our minds. We have to learn it. And in the beginning, readers access the meaning of words via the sound of the word. That is a really essential principle as well. And so that ties back into the fact of print being a code for speech. We know that skilled readers don't do that in a conscious way, that they have learned to go to meaning directly from actually looking at the word. They don't have to consciously go via the sound, but that's after multiple exposures and a process that I'm going to talk about, that's novice to skilled process that happens over a number of years and is more likely to happen with explicit instruction. Now we know that reading is about meaning, it's about comprehension. However, in order to get to comprehension, you need to be able to read the words. And that means being able to crack the code and decode words. And so the most efficient method of teaching reading to get to the meaning aspect is a code-based approach. It makes both beginning and advanced reading easier. The great thing about a code-based approach is that it's beneficial for all students. It's easier for students to learn, it is quicker for them to learn, and it's much fairer. We don't know when children begin school which students are going to struggle with reading, which are going to need more explicit instruction than others. There's no fail-safe screener. There's some screeners that will give us an idea of which children might struggle, but they're not 100% foolproof. And so therefore, the best approach is to make sure that we give all students that really explicit and effective instruction. And when we do that, it reduces the number of students who do need intervention. It gives all students the best chance of success. The basic code of written English, which we refer to as single sounds, can be taught generally in a few months if it's taught in a really effective and efficient way. The advanced code, by which I mean digraphs, trigraphs, morphemes, and affixes. So digraphs is 2 letters that represent one sound. Trigraphs is 3 letters that represent one sound. Morphemes are those larger subunits of words, and including affixes. That usually takes 2 to 3 years. So that's because English language is one of the most complex alphabetic languages to learn. We have 44 speech sounds, roughly, depending on accent and dialect. We only have 26 letters in the alphabet to represent those speech sounds. And for various historical reasons, we use 200 or so ways to represent the speech sounds using those 26 letters. And the reasons for that are that English is an old language. And it has changed a lot over time, as languages do, due to migration, changes in the way that words are pronounced, and the spellings haven't shifted, but the sounds have, and sometimes vice versa. Spelling, however, is generally more stable. Another reason is that we have incorporated other languages into ours and retained their spellings. So there are good reasons for that. Over time, there have been numerous attempts to standardize the English written language. In the Middle Ages, there was an attempt to do that, but the language shifted again. And so we still see variations within written English that just do make it more complex and more difficult to learn. However, even with that, it does have enough regularity for us to be able to teach the code explicitly and to allow generalization once children have learned the code from one word to the next. So it's not completely arbitrary. This graph shows that the findings of a study that's reported in Louisa Motz's book, and it says that around half of all English words are regular. The most regular words are one-syllable words, but even so, around 50% of words, the grapheme-phoneme correspondences are the most common ones. Then 36% only have one variation on the rules, and it's usually the vowel. And then only a small proportion are either partly regular in that they have 2 or more variations, or what we'd consider to be truly irregular. So I know that Maria talked about the science of reading earlier, and I'm going to draw out some of the key concepts from that scientific research base on reading instruction. And these are the 5 I'm going to talk about today. And I think they are the key ones, particularly in terms of word reading and how children go from complete novices through to being able to recognise, decode, and eventually automatically read words and enjoy reading and be able to comprehend it. So the first one is the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading is probably the most well-known conceptual model of reading, and it doesn't say that reading is simple, rather than this model is simple. So it says that reading comprehension is almost entirely dependent on two factors, and they are decoding or word recognition and language comprehension. So the one important element of the simple view of reading model is that that multiplication symbol there in the equation. And the reason that is important is because it demonstrates that if either one of those factors, decoding or language comprehension, is 0, then reading comprehension will be 0. If we had a plus sign in that equation there, we would be suggesting that if children can decode but they can't understand, then they can still have some level of reading comprehension. And that's just not the case. You need to be able to work out what the word is and in terms of decoding it, but then also know what the word means in order to be able to comprehend. So we will also go on to talk about Scarborough's reading rope, which teases that out even further. However, I think it's really important to note that this is one of the most consistently proven robust models of reading that have been tested over decades. So numerous studies of thousands of children, multiple countries, have shown that once you account for these two factors or measure them, then you can very, very strongly predict reading comprehension. As I mentioned earlier, Scarborough's reading rope teases out the factors of the simple view of reading into some sub-levels. And even these sub-levels have sub-levels below them. So that shows us that we're not talking about simplifying reading, but really about how we best can think about targeting support in the most effective ways. So language comprehension is teased out into background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. So each of those in themselves is a multifaceted sort of complex process. And within word recognition, there's phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. And the reading rope metaphor is really clever because it portrays how each of those strands contributes to strong and strategic reading. And if any of those is missing or is weak, then reading is going to be weaker. Let's talk about the reading brain. So the simple view of reading is supported by reading brain research. So essentially the neuroscientific research that has become more and more well known over the last decade or so in particular very much supports this idea that we need to make the connections between sound and print and meaning, and that decoding is that connection between sound and print, and then the meaning is the language comprehension. To get to reading comprehension, we have to connect those things. They have to work together. So the reading brain research also tells us that written language is a new skill, and therefore it is something that we have to learn to do. There's no way around it. It needs to be taught and it has to be learned. There isn't a reading in the area in the brain that just switches on when children are exposed to print. So unlike spoken language, where we are wired for spoken communication and it does evolve relatively naturally and spontaneously for the very large majority of children, just through being exposed to spoken language and through interaction. With reading, that's not how it works. We need to deliberately create a set of complex neuronal circuitry in the brain. So next I want to talk about what is really a key idea in reading instruction, and that is the difference between beginning readers and expert readers and how we progress from one to the other. A really great model for explaining this is the dual route cascading model, and it was developed to explain the process that is going on for both skilled readers and novice readers. So the dual route cascading model describes a phonological pathway for reading for beginning readers and what we call a lexical pathway for skilled readers. As I mentioned earlier, beginning readers need to make that connection between sound and print before they get to meaning. So they follow something called a phonological pathway to reading, and do that in initially quite an effortful way, but over time become more and more practiced and skilled at that. And so over time, they see words and decode them enough for words to become rapidly recalled, and they begin to use what we call the lexical pathway. So they go straight from print to meaning, and do that so rapidly that it's barely perceptible. Why the beginning to expert model is and concept is so important is because it tells us that we can't view beginning readers or children as mini adults, and that they will learn to read by observing skilled readers and copying what they do. They are using a very different process as they begin that word reading instruction. So just to look at that in a more simplified version. So the primary route for beginning readers is a phonological pathway. They see a written word, cat, for example, translate that into a spoken word if they have got to the point where they are decoding in quite an automatic way. They might just say cat. They may still be consciously decoding and sound it out before they say it. And it is through hearing the word either spoken out loud or in their mind that they then access the meaning of that word cat. For skilled readers, they are using that lexical pathway. So they don't necessarily need to hear the word or actually sort of consciously think about what it sounds like. They can go straight to that word meaning. However, what is so convincing about this model is that skilled readers still do use that phonological pathway. Like, no one skips it. It is, once it's been built, it stays there. So when we see a word that we've never seen before, or a word we don't see very often, or a word that looks a lot like some other similar words, we still use that phonological route to work out what that word is. So, for example, you might be reading a fantasy novel or a textbook which introduces technical terms that you haven't seen before. Even if you don't realize it, you are going back to decoding and working out the units of that word and putting it together to get to what you think that word would be. So how robust is the evidence supporting this concept and this idea of the phonological pathway? Mark Seidenberg, who's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, writes in his book that for reading scientists, the evidence that the phonological pathway is used in reading and is especially important in beginning reading is about as close to conclusive as research on complex human behaviour can get. So a pretty decisive statement there. The next thing I'll talk about is orthographic mapping. Orthographic mapping explains that shift between sounding out and reading words instantaneously. And the reason that orthographic mapping is such an important concept is that it describes the difference between the typical idea of a sight word, which is a word that you've memorized just by having it shown to you lots of times, just by its shape and visual properties, as opposed to a scientific evidence-based concept of a sight word, which is a word that you have memorized as a unique letter string. So when you orthographically map a word into your long-term memory after decoding it multiple times, you remember it as a unique set of a unique sequence of letters, and that is how you recognize the word. So the grapheme phoneme properties of the word are really essential there. It's not just about the visual, it's also about remembering the relationship between the position of the letters in the word and how that translates into sound. So one way that we can think about this and know that this is what we are doing is that when we're skilled readers, if we see a typo or an error in some writing, we can work out what it's supposed to be, but we look at it for a little bit longer. So eye tracking studies have been really informative in our understanding of orthographic mapping, because eye tracking studies show us that even on a very slight error, people fixate on that word for longer. So what's going on there is that the brain is searching for the match that seems the most likely to be the right word to go into that context. The self-teaching hypothesis flows from that orthographic mapping. After lots of practice and really good teaching, children become proficient in the code. So the self-teaching hypothesis then says that students are then able to transfer their knowledge of letter sound correspondences or grapheme phoneme correspondences and the sorts of patterns that they've seen in their reading and apply that to new and to novel words. So they begin to get a better understanding of how they can take what they've learned in one context into others. So those new words are converted into sound, they become transferred to orthographic memory initially, and then over time that's done automatically. So explicit phonics instruction kickstarts that process. It allows children to then become successful independent readers, and the more they read, then the better they get at reading. So based on those key concepts from the science of reading, what do we take from that in terms of evidence-based instruction? And what sort of research is there about what is effective instruction? You know, what has been found about what helps children to learn more efficiently and more effectively? These are some of the key documents that have informed our understanding of evidence-based instruction, beginning with the National Reading Panel in 2000. And since then, each subsequent review of research and inquiry has really built upon the National Reading Panel rather than contradicted it. So that's what makes this research so strong, is the consistency and also the depth and breadth of the evidence. And those reports land on three essential areas that need to be included in reading instruction for it to be effective. And those are what are often known as the 5 big ideas or the 5 keys. And they are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So it's not to suggest that these are covered in lockstep, that first you teach phonemic awareness and then you teach phonics and then you teach fluency. Each of these things, there is a developmental progression there, but it's on emphasis rather than in discrete steps. So right from the beginning of instruction, all of these elements will be included in an effective reading instruction program. It's just that the emphasis will change over time. Just a quick review of the concepts we talked about earlier. There's the simple view of reading, Scarborough's reading rope, and those 5 keys. And they all cover the same ideas. So phonemic awareness and phonics, and to some extent fluency, fit into that decoding aspect of the simple view, and the word recognition aspect of the reading rope, and then vocabulary and comprehension into the language comprehension and reading comprehension factors. Fluency is an interesting one. Fluency we can think about in terms of automaticity in word reading. That's one type of fluency. And then there's also passage reading fluency. And it draws on both automaticity in word reading and on comprehension. So it is sometimes one of the least well understood. It doesn't fit neatly into one category. It actually draws on multiple skills. So in terms of effective instruction, I'll look at that first aspect of the simple view of reading first, and that's word recognition or decoding. And there is very strong evidence that the best way to achieve accurate and efficient word recognition is through systematic synthetic phonics instruction. So by synthetic, we mean building up words from the very smallest subunit of a written word, that's graphemes and phonemes. By systematic, we mean that we are teaching in a really carefully developed sequence from simple to complex, with mastery learning and cumulative review. So it's a very well planned and methodical approach to teaching the code. It also involves blending and segmenting very early in the process. So it's certainly not the case that in synthetic phonics instruction, children learn all of the letter sound correspondences and then learn how to put them together into words. Those two aspects of reading are integrated from the very start. So moving on to the second part of the simple view is language comprehension. And so that encompasses vocabulary, knowledge of language structures, background knowledge, and literacy knowledge. So, for example, the text genre, so different purposes of text. And so evidence-based instruction should include planned and systematic instruction in all of these aspects as well. So evidence-based instruction is not just about word reading, it's about this language comprehension as well. So I'll talk a little bit about one element of that in particular, and that's vocabulary. And vocabulary can be taught explicitly and systematically in following the same principles as those that guide explicit and systematic phonics instruction. So that means building from simple to complex, thinking about the tiers of vocabulary that are described in this book, Bringing Words to Life. So thinking about which types of words would be most strategically useful to focus instruction on, which words are the ones that children are least likely to have just learned through conversation, but are going to be most useful for them in terms of reading and writing. There's also repetition and recall, which is again a part of that science of learning, that we need students to be able to move things from working memory into long-term memory so that they can then build that into everything else that they know and begin to build generalization and transfer. We need to make those connections with prior learning and knowledge and the use in multiple contexts. And again, making sure that that is built into an instructional program that is planned, explicit and systematic. So unlike the code, however, vocabulary can't be learned through explicit instruction alone. It's too big. So even though we talked about how complex the writing code is, it is still what we call a constrained skill or a constrained set of knowledge that it can be learned in its entirety. And once it's learned, then it's a matter of then building skill in use. However, vocabulary is almost limitless. And so we just do not have time in school to teach it all explicitly. It has been estimated that students need to know about 8,000 word families by the time they finish primary school. So it's a pretty simple mathematical process to work out that there's no way you could do all of that in the school day. So most of this vocabulary is instead acquired through reading. And of course, therefore, the sooner that we have children reading independently, the sooner that they will start acquiring their vocabulary through reading. So you can see that virtuous cycle there, and why there is such an emphasis on establishing a really strong word reading capacity in the first few years of school. Again, not ignoring comprehension and vocabulary, but making sure those fundamentals are there as quickly as possible so that children can move into that self-teaching phase and start to acquire greater vocabulary and also to enjoy reading and to build their background knowledge, which is also another essential aspect of reading comprehension. So let's talk now about policy and practice and whether or not it reflects all of that strong evidence around how children learn to read and the effective ways to teach them. So in the last couple of weeks, I'm sure you're all aware that the Right to Read report was released. It's a fabulous report. It could not be any clearer about the causes of reading difficulties for many students and what the solutions are. And this is just, one very strong quote from that report, and it says, despite decades of multidisciplinary research on what is most effective for teaching students early reading skills, Ontario is systematically failing students with reading disabilities and many other students. Word level reading difficulties are the most common challenge for students who struggle to learn to read well. Most students who have issues with reading comprehension have word level reading difficulties. So you can see very clearly there how strongly that aligns with what I've been talking about in terms of the simple view of reading, that word reading capacity, and language comprehension as the main factors, and how important it is to establish those word level reading skills in the first few years of school. The key messages that I think are very powerful in the Right to Read report is that a large proportion of the students who struggle with reading do not have a reading disability in the technical sense. They're what are sometimes called instructional casualties. That is, that if they had been taught in the first few years of school to read using these effective and evidence-based strategies, they would not be struggling with reading. So with high quality evidence-based instruction using those key concepts, the severity and the number of students who struggle with reading will dramatically reduce. And that is something that I see on a daily basis almost, that when schools change the way that they teach reading in the classroom for all students, they have far less need for intervention. And the great thing about that is, apart from the fact that we have fewer students who need intervention, the ones that do can really get focused attention and resources directed towards them. And also a key element of that is making sure that the interventions they receive are effective and evidence-based as well. I thought you might be interested to know that, that Ontario isn't alone in this, that this is something that Australia has been struggling with for quite some time as well. So I thought I'd just give you a quick history of literacy policy development in Australia over the last, what is it now, nearly almost 20 years. So in 2004, there was a letter or an open letter given to the Federal Education Minister at the time, Brendan Nelson. And this letter said from these eminent reading researchers and scientists that we would like particularly to draw your attention to the continuing discrepancy between the model of reading development that forms the basis for most of our current school curricula and teaching methods, and the model of reading development that is emerging as a result of the research into reading that has been undertaken over the past 20 to 30 years. So that was then, that was in 2004. It was already pretty clear that there was a science of reading that should be informing instruction and curriculum, and just wasn't. So this letter renewed that debate, and I'm sure you'll see the parallel there between the statement in that letter and in the Right to Read report. So that led to a national inquiry in 2005, and that committee found or recommended that teachers provide systematic, direct and explicit phonics instruction so that children master the essential alphabetic code breaking skills required for foundational reading proficiency. Equally, that teachers provide an integrated approach to reading that supports the development of oral language, vocabulary, grammar, reading fluency, comprehension and the literacies of new technologies. So again, you can see the similarities there. So since then, there have been developments, and as much as we might despair sometimes at the slow rate of progress, it's good to take stock occasionally and look at what has changed. So we have had a national curriculum in Australia since 2012. So the Australian curriculum has been reviewed twice since it was first introduced, one only a few years after it was published, and the new version in 2015 placed a stronger emphasis on phonics instruction in particular and the literacy aspect. A draft of the latest revision, which was put out for consultation last year, met with strong criticism because it still retained, even, was it 6 years later, non-evidence-based approaches, including the 3 cueing method and the use of predictable readers. So it went back for further review, hoping to see the new version of that very soon. Another change that happened between the original version and more recently, and this might seem like a fairly trivial thing, but in fact it's quite profound, because people who were still devoted to a balanced literacy approach, drawing on multiple cues for reading, for word reading in particular, were using the definition of decoding in the Australian curriculum to support their continuing use of that approach. So just changing the definition of decoding to a more evidence-based definition that's used in scientific reading literature was really a significant victory, because it means that the Australian curriculum now recognises that as the process of decoding, that using letters and sounds to work out how to say and read written words is the most efficient strategy for word recognition. In 2018, we also had published the National Literacy Learning Progressions, which sit alongside the Australian curriculum and just give a more granular progression of literacy learning, including for phonics and for word recognition. And the idea of the progression is to help teachers think about the sequence of skills that need to be learned and how they develop over particularly the first few years of school. So this is just one example of the content of the progression, and you can see it's quite detailed and explicit. So this is phonics knowledge and word reading. It's descriptor number 5. And it separates those two things out, acknowledges that some high frequency words need to be taught just as they are so that children can read connected texts, but the largest emphasis should be on decoding and learning that phonic code. The New South Wales syllabus is also currently under revision. However, the first part of that, the K-2 element, which is the first 3 years of full-time formal schooling, was released last year. And it, much to everyone's delight, was very strongly aligned with the evidence-based literacy instruction. The structure of that syllabus really clearly sets out those essential elements of reading that I spoke about earlier, those 5 keys to reading, but also adding in, of course, because it's literacy more broadly, the writing element. So responding to literature and also creating texts. We've also had introduced in a few states the Year 1 phonics screening check. So it is an assessment that was designed and implemented in English primary schools from 2012. It was recommended by an expert advisory group to be implemented in Australia in 2017. And since then, 3 states have adopted it as being a systemic assessment. So all students in Year 1 in South Australia, first of all, and then New South Wales, and next year Tasmania, will do the phonics screening check towards the end of Year 1. And the phonics screening check is really an important assessment because it tells us at that very critical stage of children's reading development whether or not they have developed decoding skills. So in 2019, a report was published which was co-authored by myself and Linda Meeks, and we looked quite closely at the content and other aspects of the literacy units in undergraduate initial teaching education degrees. And we looked at 38 universities, which offer 66 different undergraduate teaching degrees, and within them there were 116 different core literacy units. So only 4% of those literacy units had a specific focus on early reading instruction or early literacy. So there's very little acknowledgement of that beginner to skilled reading development trajectory that I talked about, and the idea that beginning reading is a very specific aspect of reading instruction. So that report, shortchanged report, made a number of recommendations. First was that there just was not enough time being spent on literacy in teacher preparation. It was about 1/16, so a very tiny proportion of time devoted to learning how to teach reading, and we know that that is very, very much less than the amount of time in a teacher's day that is devoted to teaching reading. So that was one element that was recommended, that there's simply more time, but also that there would be more evidence-based content in those degrees. As a result of that, later that year, Education Council, which is made up of all the state and territory education ministers and the federal minister, endorsed making changes to the accreditation standards, which meant that in order for teaching degrees to be considered a qualifying degree that would allow someone to register as a teacher, they needed to meet these new standards, particularly for literacy content. So an increase in the amount of time, but also the early reading instruction should address evidence-based practice across phonemic awareness, phonics fluency, vocabulary comprehension, and oral language. However, as usual, we get so far and then no further. So the Next Steps report was the most recent review of initial teacher education and was released only a couple of weeks ago. And it found that these programs are still not consistently preparing pre-service teachers to use evidence-based reading instruction. So even though the standard was there, it was still not being met in a large number of cases. And it made a number of recommendations, including funding incentives, so allocating more funding to providers that meet the standards, and also the publications of quality indicators, so to make it more transparent which universities were actually meeting those standards around reading instruction and other sorts of quality indicators, and that would drive demand for students to enroll in those courses over others. So some of the markers of progress that show that we are, gradually but surely moving towards having more evidence-based instruction and therefore higher literacy levels is the Tasmanian government last year announced its goal to have 100% literacy. And so that involves an expert panel and really trying to ensure that by the end of primary school, all children can read at a proficient level. And that is really a goal that, if achieved, will be absolutely life-changing for students. There are a number of teacher-led groups that are exploding in terms of their membership and an interest. So there are Facebook groups like Reading Science in Schools that have over 30,000 members that are very interactive and providing information from teachers to teachers about evidence-based reading instruction. And then there are groups like Think Forward Educators that are providing professional learning, largely delivered by teachers, but with some contributions by researchers as well. There's enormously high demand for professional learning on science of reading and evidence-based instruction. There are media reports, it seems like every day, on schools that have turned around their performance and made big improvements because they have moved to an explicit instruction and particularly a phonics instruction approach in the early years. In terms of uptake of systematic synthetic phonics programs, that is becoming much more widespread as well. And I'm talking about both programs that are freely available, but also commercial programs and published programs like Multilit. There's quite a lot of demand for those programs because schools are seeing such dramatically improved results when they use them, and word of mouth starts to get around. And in terms of the statistics, we have seen some improvement over the last few years in Year 3 reading achievement. So that's the first year that we collect national statistics on reading. And after a number of years where not much has changed, over the last 5 years, we have seen an uptick in most states and territories. And when you start to plot that against the implementation of evidence-based reading instruction, you can definitely see a relationship between the two. So a little bit of information about where you can read more. There are these books here and publications here, which I've mentioned earlier. Particularly recommend the publication called Ending the Reading Wars by Castles, Rassel and Nation. That's available for download. It's very comprehensive. The Read About It report, which is published by 5 from 5, is a much more condensed document. So if you are happy with a long read, go with Ending the Reading Wars. If you want a bit of a more accessible entry point, then try Read About It first, but certainly then move on to the others. Language at the Speed of Sight is a book, very in-depth, but very engaging and fascinating. We also offer free professional learning, so the time difference may make some of these a little difficult for some of you in Ontario, but we will be eventually providing these as pre-recorded videos. At the moment, we only deliver them live, but over time, we'll start to create a library of those. But if you don't mind an early morning or a late night, then feel free to register for those, and you can do that using that QR code. Or just go to the 5 from 5 website. Again, thank you for inviting me. A great honour to be able to speak to you, especially in the wake of the Right to Read report. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.